the end of the 20th century, scientists who knew the Mojave Desert began to see that the environment was changing in an unsettling way, and that it might be a sign of trouble for a native species known as the desert tortoise that seemed to be disappearing from the landscape.
There's many researchers that work with desert tortoises that have been out there for decades working with them, and they noticed over a period of years in the late 80s that every year that they would go out, there were fewer and fewer tortoises.
The disappearance of these desert tortoises was dramatic enough that some scientists described it as a population crash.
Some of these populations really took a major decline, and in some areas of the range it was estimated that up to 90% of them were lost.
But what could have been behind such a disturbing decline? It was the first of many complex questions researchers had to consider. So they started to wonder whether the missing tortoises had been eaten by predators, poisoned by pollution, deprived of food, water, or land to live on. But almost immediately, scientists also saw the symptoms of a potentially deadly disease.
They were starting to see the runny nose and the watery eyes and things that made them think that there was an upper respiratory infection. And so when we see the tortoises dying, we don't know what the connection is, but there's a lot of tortoises that aren't here anymore that used to be.
And that concerned researchers because the desert tortoise has been living in the Mojave longer than anyone can remember, maybe even for millions of years. During that time, they've been so slow to change that ancient tortoises might look just like their modern brothers and sisters.
I've often seen them referred to as living dinosaurs, and they're very old. They've been around a long time, and if you look at some of the fossil tortoises, they really haven't changed that much. They're kind of like alligators or something. They have basically the same structure and morphology as they had, millions of years ago.
After many generations of adapting to this environment, tortoises have become essential members of the Mojave Desert community, and that qualifies them as a keystone species.
As a keystone species, they play a huge role in the structure of their ecosystem, and it's actually disproportionate to their size. So here you have this little tortoise that really impacts the desert in a huge way, because the Mojave Desert would not be what it is today without desert tortoises.
First, because they're expert desert diggers, creating shelters to protect themselves and even other animals against predators, the heat, cold, and other extreme conditions.
They're very adept at digging burrows, and those burrows that they dig provide shelters for many other species of wildlife, including other reptiles, birds, mammals, and invertebrates.
And they're natural desert gardeners. Many of the plants they eat, they eventually leave behind as seeds, already pre-fertilized and ready to grow again.
So whatever these guys eat, it takes them about a month to digest, but as they digest the food, the seed comes out and the fecal matter and basically replants the desert. And so all the other animals that are also eating that food are depending on the tortoises for that.
Since the health of the tortoise is so closely connected to the environmental condition of the desert, they can be considered an indicator species.
The status and well-being and health of the desert tortoise is a pretty good indicator of the status, well-being, and health of the Mojave Desert ecosystem.
But over the years, as more and more humans have moved into the tortoise's territory, we've altered their natural habitat and disrupted their normal behavior.
Tortoises show amazing sight fidelity, where they know their surroundings and they know exactly where their water resources are, where their mineral resources are, who their neighbors are, where their burrows are, where their mates are. And so removing a tortoise from an area that could be slated for development, or just moving a tortoise in general to a whole new area, they have a whole new area to learn.
And they have to face greater threats from the many predators that are attracted by the garbage we leave behind.
With an increased human population, you have increased trash and people dumping around the city. They leave a lot of food for the predators, like ravens and coyotes. And so when their numbers increase, they look for other opportunities for food, which happens to be tortoise. The tortoise babies are really soft, and so they're a really easy target for ravens and coyotes to eat.
Finally, in 1989, there was enough concern about the decreasing numbers of the desert tortoise population that they were officially listed as being threatened reptiles according to the Federal Endangered Species Act.
The Endangered Species Act that we know today was enacted in 1973, and it was enacted to protect species that were determined to be threatened or endangered.
The listing created new opportunities for researchers to investigate the desert tortoise's difficulties with one clear goal in mind:
to improve the status of the species to the point where protection under the Act is no longer required.
But they began to see that there might be all kinds of complex reasons the species was having such a tough time.
The crash was something we could measure, but trying to figure out why there was a crash, that was what we still can't pinpoint. And the current thought is that the tortoise suffers from what some scientists say is death by 1,000 cuts, which means you can't point to one threat and say, okay, that is the threat that's causing the decline.
So the scientists have to examine every possible threat, then try to put together a more complete picture of what's troubling the tortoise.
When you're designing a scientific study, you inherently want to focus on one variable, because if you include multiple variables and you detect an effect, you're not sure which variable caused that effect. So a lot of the science and research that has gone into assessing desert tortoise populations have focused on one variable, and understandably so. However, now when you're managing it, I try to take these various sort of pieces of the puzzle and put it together to look at all of the problems that the desert tortoise is operating under.
The best way to know how many have hatched and how many have died is simply to count them regularly. But that's been a particularly challenging task for researchers who have to try to find these camouflaged, slow-moving, burrowing reptiles that are so perfectly adapted to hide almost anywhere in the vast Mojave Desert.
We have struggled for several years trying to come up with a methodology to measure how many tortoise, or to count tortoises, or to determine what the trends are, and it's been very challenging for a species that, you know, is only active, you know, 20% of the time or so, and they're very cryptic, they're hard to find, and they occur over millions of acres. And try to come up with some way to determine, are there more, are their trends increasing, or are they still decreasing over really large areas is difficult.
That's why every spring researchers walk assigned lines called transects all over the Mojave, looking for tortoises that have emerged from their underground burrows after their period of winter activity is over.
The line that they walk is 12 kilometers around, and it's teams of 2 people, and there's this very specific way that they have to do this. They go through 3 weeks of training before they're actually allowed to do this, so that they can gain a search image for the tortoise, and that is, when they look for a tortoise, they easily distinguish between a tortoise and a rock.
And when we find one, we'll measure how far from this hypothetical line the tortoise is, and we'll put that into a calculation and try to come up with an estimate of abundance. And it's usually numbers of tortoises per square kilometer or square mile.
Then, year after year, scientists will compare the numbers of tortoises they see to determine if the population is still in trouble, has stabilized, or is recovering.
Once you have a baseline, then every year you'll have a number that you would compare to that baseline. If the number's the same every year, then you would call that a stable population. If you go back after your baseline and you find it's down, and you go back the next year and it's down, then you'd have a declining population, and of course the opposite would be true for an increasing population.
And this study of trends could continue for decades before the researchers understand whether the desert tortoise is thriving again. Unfortunately, one place there have been plenty of tortoises is in people's backyards, where they're kept as pets.
I think that the desert tortoise is unique in that it's one of the only federally listed species that we allow people to have as pets within their natural range.
Captive tortoises that aren't properly cared for, that are allowed to breed and have babies, that get loose or get released into the desert, can cause other kinds of trouble for the native populations.
We have a huge pet tortoise problem in the valley, and people, if they can't take care of them or they don't want them anymore, instead of taking them to a shelter or the Desert Tortoise Conservation Center, they sometimes release them into the wild, which then you have genetic mixing. It could be a Sonoran desert tortoise that you release in the Mojave Desert, and the disease issue with that as well.
It's better if people call the Desert Tortoise Conservation Center to come collect their pets and take them where they can get some much-needed care and attention.
The greatest percentage, over 80%, I would say, were in only fair to poor condition. They were really not looking good when they got here. So we do a visual assessment. We really look at them from head to toe. We note if there's any anomalies, abnormalities, any trauma, anything like that. And immediately we do this quick kind of go through on the tortoise to see, does it need medical assistance?
Here, tortoises are given a temporary home and time to recover in the hope that they can one day live healthier lives in more natural surroundings.
If you surrender your pet tortoise and it comes here to the Tortoise Center, it has the potential to go home, which is back to the desert.
And researchers have very carefully planned an experimental program called translocation, where they can release tortoises into a desert setting while still observing how they'll adjust to living in a different habitat.
Our translocation is very scientifically based, so we don't just go to a translocation site and let them go and wish them well. They're actually very specifically designed, because our goal is to find out what is the best way to do a translocation and how does it work best for tortoises. How are they most likely to succeed, adapt to the new environment, those sorts of questions.
They'll stay in touch with the tortoises through radio tracking and global positioning technology.
They will get a regular radio transmitter, which has a VHF on it, so that there's a radio frequency and we can walk around and find them easily. But some of them are also outfitted with GPS transmitters, so we know where they are pretty much every hour of every day. They'll be running the data, making maps, all kinds of really interesting things that will help us figure out where is the best place to release tortoises.
But finding good desert tortoise territory in the Mojave Desert could become an even more complicated problem because of unexpected threats such as an ongoing drought that may be drying up many of their sources of food and water.
Tortoises don't really have to drink all that much. They get most of their water through the food they eat. They store most of the water in their bladder, and if it's excessive drought, if they don't get any water for over a year, then yes, it can kill them. So if it was an excessive drought, 15 years, and they haven't been able to find water, then that definitely could be an issue.
Researchers also fear the effects of some recent and surprisingly large wildfires that could cause the desert tortoise's future to go up in flames.
The Mojave Desert isn't fire adapted. It's not supposed to burn from really at all, but because we have an influx of invasive grasses, it's causing fires to be carried, and we've had over 200,000 acres burned since 2005.
One lesson the scientists have definitely learned is that you can never separate the tortoise from the desert without endangering them both.
If you love the tortoise, take care of the desert, because it's the only place that the tortoise can really live and thrive. You know, it's not an understatement to say that we will lose our Mojave Desert if we lose our tortoises. And that's really why we need to protect these guys.
And you can do your part by keeping the desert clean, staying on designated roads and trails when traveling through the desert, and remembering that you should never touch a tortoise or take one away from its home, because their success or failure as a species may have many unforeseen effects on our own ability to live here in the Mojave.
We always think that every species has a purpose, and we may not know what that purpose is, but it more than likely has a purpose, and once that species is gone, then it may be too late, and that's maybe when you find out what its purpose was.
Now that you know the enormous role the desert tortoise plays in its native environment, it's easy to see why everybody's best efforts to protect it should really be no trouble at all.